History books taught us about powerful presidents, great speeches, and legendary leadership, but they carefully avoided one impossible secret. Hidden behind the walls of the White House was a truth so disturbing that for generations it was whispered, denied, and buried. A president celebrated as a symbol of freedom was privately living a double life, one built on power, silence, and slavery. His wife knew her sister. America knew her as property. While the nation spoke of liberty, an enslaved woman lived only a few steps away from the most powerful office in the world, bound not by love but by law, fear, and control. What followed was not a rumor or a single scandal, but a secret so carefully concealed that it survived decades of denial. 6 children born into a world that refused to acknowledge them, carrying the blood of a president who could never publicly claim them. Why was this truth erased from classrooms? Who worked so hard to protect the image of a man while destroying the lives of those who carried his legacy in silence? And how did an entire nation participate in pretending this story never happened? Tonight we uncover the impossible secret America was never meant to face, a story of power, betrayal, and children born into shadows hidden by history itself. The respected president stood before the nation as a carefully constructed symbol, a man whose public image was polished until it reflected only strength, intellect, and moral authority. Portraits captured him in composed stillness, dressed in dignity, framed by the language of liberty and leadership. Speeches written in careful prose spoke of ideals larger than any one person, and history books repeated those words until they hardened into unquestioned truth. To the outside world he was disciplined, rational, and deserving of admiration, a figure whose life appeared to align perfectly with the values he claimed to defend. Yet this image did not exist by accident. It was protected, reinforced, and defended with relentless precision, because behind it existed a private reality that could never be allowed into the light. In his world, reputation was not simply personal, it was political currency. A president's character was inseparable from the nation's sense of itself, and any crack in that image threatened more than one man's legacy. The public was shown a marriage that symbolized stability and respectability, a household that reflected order and refinement, a life that suggested restraint and honor. What was hidden was not merely an affair or a lapse in judgment, but an entire system of contradictions that revealed how power truly functioned when no one was watching. The difference between who he appeared to be and who he was allowed himself to become in private was vast, and it was sustained by laws, customs, and silence. Inside his home the hierarchy was unmistakable. Freedom and authority flowed in one direction, obedience and vulnerability in another. The same man who spoke publicly about human dignity lived daily within a structure that denied it to others, and he did so without seeing himself as immoral. In his mind, the system justified him. Enslavement was legal, normalized, and woven into the fabric of elite society, allowing him to separate his actions from his conscience. This separation became the foundation of his double life. He could be admired as a leader while exercising absolute control over people who had no legal right to refuse him, no voice that could challenge him, and no protection against his desires. The respect he commanded created an invisible shield. Servants, guests, political allies, and even family members learned what could be acknowledged and what must never be spoken aloud. Whispers stayed behind closed doors, glances replaced words. Everyone understood that certain truths were dangerous, not because they were uncertain but because they were undeniable. His status ensured that any accusation would be dismissed as insolence, any evidence reframed as misunderstanding, and any witness silenced by fear or dependence. Power did not need to announce itself, it was simply present, shaping behavior without explanation. Public admiration allowed him to move through society without scrutiny. When people looked at him, they saw what they wanted to see: a founder, a statesman, a president worthy of reverence. This collective belief made it easier to ignore contradictions. The idea that such a man could commit acts that violated the moral ideals he represented was too uncomfortable to confront. It was simpler to assume that greatness erased human flaws, or that flaws, if they existed, were insignificant compared to achievements. This willingness to excuse, to rationalize, to look away became one of his greatest protections. His private life unfolded in spaces the public never entered, governed by rules entirely different from those he upheld in public. There he was not constrained by the expectations of voters or historians. He was constrained only by his own sense of entitlement and the limits imposed by secrecy. The people around him were not equals. They were subjects. Their survival depended on his favor, their futures determined by his decisions. This imbalance allowed intimacy without accountability, control without consequence, and silence without consent. The respected president became a man whose authority extended into the most personal realms of others' lives, shaping destinies without acknowledgement. What made the secret so enduring was not merely the act itself, but the careful maintenance of appearances. Letters were guarded, movements discreet, explanations rehearsed. Any sign of irregularity was absorbed into the routine of household life. disguised as ordinary domestic management. Children could exist without recognition, their presence explained away through convenient fiction. The machinery of denial worked because it was supported by an entire society that benefited from preserving the illusion of virtue at the top. The president's image was not protected by one person but by many, each playing a role in keeping the story intact. Even history itself became an accomplice. Early biographers wrote with reverence, selecting details that reinforced greatness and omitting those that complicated it. Archives were curated, family narratives polished, uncomfortable testimonies dismissed as unreliable. Over time, repetition transformed omission into fact. What was not written might as well not have existed, and the president's reputation hardened into legend. Generations inherited this version of the man, unaware that it had been shaped as much by silence as by truth. The respected president learned that authority could outlive morality. As long as he fulfilled his public role effectively, his private actions remained beyond challenge. This realization did not require cruelty, it required indifference. He did not need to justify himself to those without power because the world had already decided whose lives mattered enough to be recorded. The contradiction between his ideals and his actions did not trouble the structure that elevated him, because that structure was designed to protect men like him. And so the image endured, pristine and celebrated, while the reality remained fragmented, scattered across whispered memories, unmarked graves and lives lived in the margins of official history. The president's name continued to be spoken with respect. His legacy invoked as a symbol of national identity, even as the human cost of preserving that image remained hidden in plain sight, waiting beneath the surface of admiration, waiting in the spaces between what was said and what was deliberately left unsaid, waiting in the silence that followed every praise, every portrait, every carefully chosen word that described him as honorable, virtuous, and beyond reproach, while the truth lingered just outside the frame, pressing against the edges of history, refusing to disappear, existing in the shadows of reputation that could not survive full daylight and continuing to echo through time as an unresolved presence that challenges the very idea of greatness built on concealment and power that was never meant to be questioned and still remains suspended between acknowledgement and denial without ever fully being allowed to exist as a complete and spoken truth. She entered the household not as a guest, not as family in the eyes of the law but as property, her identity reduced to a ledger entry that defined her value in terms of labor and obedience. Though she shared blood with the woman of the house, that bond meant nothing once it crossed the rigid boundary of race and status. Inside those walls, sisterhood dissolved into ownership, and familiarity became another tool of control. She moved through the same rooms, breathed the same air, and witnessed the same daily rituals as those who called themselves free. Yet every step she took was governed by rules that denied her autonomy and voice. Her position was uniquely cruel because it blurred the lines between intimacy and captivity. She was close enough to be seen, yet never close enough to be acknowledged. The family resemblance could not be erased, but it was never spoken of openly. Instead, it lingered in glances, in the shape of her face, in the quiet recognition that passed wordlessly between those who noticed but dared not comment. The household learned to treat this contradiction as normal. Silence became a form of discipline, training everyone within its walls to accept what could not be reconciled but must not be questioned. Owned by law, she had no legal protection against the desires or decisions of the man who controlled her fate. Consent was irrelevant in a system that did not recognize her as fully human. Her presence in the household was justified by custom and statute, reinforced by a society that normalized the exploitation of enslaved women, especially those whose proximity to power made resistance unthinkable. Any suffering she endured remained invisible, absorbed into the routine of daily life, dismissed as an expected consequence of her status, rather than a violation of her humanity. Living under the same roof as her sister intensified the cruelty. The woman who shared her childhood memories, her ancestry and her physical traits, occupied a position of authority that could not be challenged. Their relationship was reshaped by the institution that separated them, turning kinship into hierarchy. The sister who was free benefited from a system that oppressed the sister who was enslaved, even as both were bound to the same man in profoundly unequal ways. This imbalance was not accidental. It was the result of laws designed to preserve power, inheritance and racial boundaries at any cost. The household functioned as a microcosm of the larger society, where proximity to whiteness and power did not guarantee protection for those marked as property. She was expected to serve quietly, to remain unobtrusive, to accept her role without visible resistance. Any display of emotion risked punishment, any assertion of selfhood interpreted as defiance. Her survival depended on reading unspoken rules, anticipating moods and navigating a space where affection and threat could exist side by side without warning. Despite her captivity, she was not invisible. Her labor sustained the household, her presence shaping daily routines in ways rarely acknowledged. She prepared meals, cared for children, maintained order, all while being denied recognition as anything other than an asset. Yet the intimacy of her work made her unavoidable. She was there in moments of vulnerability, in private spaces, in the rhythms of domestic life that exposed the hypocrisy of those who claimed moral superiority while relying on her unfree labor. This closeness created discomfort that was resolved not by questioning the system, but by hardening attitudes and reinforcing silence. Her body existed at the intersection of control and desire, a site where power asserted itself most brutally. Enslaved women were denied the right to refuse, and her position within the household made her particularly vulnerable. Any children born of this imbalance inherited her status, their lives predetermined by laws that ensured the continuity of exploitation. Motherhood offered no protection. It only deepened her entanglement in a system that used her reproductive capacity to increase wealth and secure legacy while denying her the authority to claim her own offspring. The knowledge of her condition extended beyond the household, though it was rarely acknowledged publicly. Visitors, servants and political allies saw enough to understand, yet chose discretion over confrontation. Speaking the truth carried risks that few were willing to take. Challenging the ownership of an enslaved woman within such a powerful household meant challenging the legitimacy of the entire social order. It was easier to accept the contradiction than to dismantle the system that produced. Her existence disrupted the carefully curated image of respectability that surrounded the family. She was a reminder that beneath the surface of refinement lay a structure built on coercion and inequality. To manage this disruption, the household relied on routine and normalization. By treating her status as ordinary, they reduced its moral weight, allowing themselves to move through daily life without reckoning with the injustice at its core. Over time, repetition transformed discomfort into indifference. Yet within her own mind, memory and awareness persisted. She knew who she was, where she came from, and how the law had stripped her of recognition. Her thoughts, hopes and fears remained her own, even as her body was controlled by others. Survival required resilience that went unrecorded, strength expressed in endurance rather than rebellion, choices made within constraints so narrow they were barely visible to those who judged her from a position of freedom. Her story was lived in fragments, moments stolen from observation, emotions concealed for safety. The children she bore complicated the household further, embodying the contradictions everyone worked to ignore. Their resemblance to those in power could not be entirely concealed, yet their status marked them as property. They grew up witnessing the same inequality that defined their mother's life, learning early which doors were closed to them and why. Their existence challenged the narrative of separation between public virtue and private reality, yet the law provided a convenient solution by classifying them according to their mother's status, ensuring that the line between free and enslaved remained intact. As years passed, her presence became part of the background, a constant that required no explanation. New generations entered the household without questioning why one sister held authority while the other remained owned. The system reproduced itself through habit and silence, teaching obedience not only to the enslaved, but to everyone who benefited from pretending not to see. Her life unfolded within this closed circle, shaped by forces larger than any individual, sustained by laws and customs that turned injustice into routine. She lived at the center of power yet possessed none of it, her proximity offering no shield against exploitation. Her story was not written down in her own words, preserved instead through hints, records and the memories of others who spoke cautiously or not at all. What remains is a partial outline, a life traced through absence, as much as presence, defined by what could not be seen, what was deliberately ignored, and what continued to exist quietly within the walls of a household that presented itself as orderly and respectable, while relying on her captivity to sustain its daily reality and its hidden truths, that continued to shape every interaction, every relation, every unspoken rule governing her existence, and the lives entwined with hers as time moved forward without offering release or recognition. Within the White House, power was not an abstract idea discussed in speeches or debated in law books. It was lived daily, enforced through routines, gestures and unspoken rules that governed who could speak, who could move freely, and who existed only to serve. Every corridor reflected a hierarchy shaped by race, status and authority, a structure so normalized that it rarely needed to be explained. The building symbolized democracy to the outside world, yet inside its walls inequality functioned smoothly, protected by tradition and reinforced by silence. What appeared orderly on the surface concealed a system that depended on racial domination to sustain its race, defined every interaction. It determined where one slept, what one wore, how one addressed others, and whether one's presence was acknowledged or ignored. Enslaved individuals moved through the same spaces as statesmen and guests,
yet occupied an entirely different reality. Their labor maintained the illusion of refinement, their invisibility allowing those in power to perform civility without confronting its cost. This separation was not accidental. It was engineered through laws and customs that transformed racial difference into a justification for control, ensuring that authority remained concentrated in the hands of a few. Silence was the most powerful tool within these. It functioned as a form of discipline, teaching everyone what could be noticed and what must be overlooked. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the room. Eyes shifted away from uncomfortable truths. Questions dissolved before being spoken. This collective restraint did not require explicit orders. It was learned through observation and consequence. Those who broke the silence risked social isolation, professional ruin, or worse, making compliance the safer choice. Over time, silence became second nature, a habit that protected power by refusing to name its abuses. The president stood at the center of this structure, embodying authority in both symbolic and practical ways. His presence set the tone, signaling what behaviors were acceptable and which realities were to remain hidden. He did not need to issue commands for silence to prevail. His status ensured everyone within the household understood that preserving his image was paramount, not only for his sake but for the stability of the political order he represented. To challenge him was to challenge the nation itself, a risk few were willing to take. Inside the White House, race shaped intimacy as much as it shaped labor. Enslaved people were present in private moments, witnessing vulnerability, conflict, and contradiction, yet they were expected to remain emotionally absent. Their proximity did not grant them humanity in the eyes of the system. Instead, it heightened their exploitation. They were close enough to know the truth, but powerless to act on it. This imbalance created a tension that permeated daily life, resolved not through justice but through enforced quiet. The architecture of the building mirrored the social order it contained. Public rooms displayed grandeur and openness, while service areas remained hidden, designed to facilitate movement without visibility. This physical separation reinforced the idea that some lives existed to be seen and celebrated, while others existed only to support from the margin. Even within shared spaces, invisible boundaries dictated behavior, reminding everyone of their place. The building itself became a participant in maintaining inequality, shaping interactions through design as much as through policy. Silence also protected racial myths that sustained the system. The idea of benevolent authority, of harmonious coexistence, depended on ignoring evidence to the contrary. Enslaved people were portrayed as content, loyal, and grateful, narratives that absolved those in power of responsibility. Within the White House, these myths were reinforced through routine, allowing those who benefited to view themselves as moral while participating in exploitation. Acknowledging the truth would have required dismantling not only personal reputations, but the ideological foundation of the nation. Power operated through selective recognition. Some lives were documented, celebrated, and remembered. Others were reduced to numbers, roles, or footnotes. This distinction determined whose experiences mattered enough to be preserved. Enslaved individuals inside the White House left few records in their own voices. Their stories filtered through the perspectives of those who controlled them. This absence was not accidental. It was the result of a system that denied them the tools to record their lives while elevating the narratives of those in authority. The silence extended beyond the walls into the broader society. Visitors who observed the contradictions carried them back into the world, choosing discretion over disclosure. Journalists avoided questions that threatened access. Politicians prioritized alliances over truth. Each act of omission reinforced the idea that some stories were too dangerous to tell. The White House became not only a seat of government but a training ground for complicity, teaching those who passed through it how to protect power by refusing to speak. Race ensured that silence fell unevenly. White individuals within the household could choose when to look away. Enslaved individuals had no such choice. Their survival depended on restraint, on understanding when silence was protection and when speech invited punishment. This enforced quiet shaped identities, teaching lessons about worth and a belonging that lasted far beyond the walls of the building. Children born into this environment learned early which voices carried weight, and which were expected to fade into the background. Even moments of apparent progress were constrained by this structure. Discussions of freedom, equality, and justice occurred within a space that denied those very principles to many who inhabited it. The language of liberty echoed through halls maintained by unfree labor, creating a dissonance that was resolved through denial rather than reform. Power allowed these contradictions to coexist without accountability, transforming ideals into performance rather than practice. The White House functioned as a stage where national identity was carefully curated. Every public appearance reinforced a narrative of unity and virtue, while backstage realities told a different story. Those who worked behind the scenes understood the cost of maintaining this illusion. They saw how race determined whose suffering could be ignored and whose comfort was prioritized, yet the system offered no avenue for redress, only the expectation of endurance. Silence also shaped memory. What happened inside the White House was filtered before entering the historical record, ensuring that uncomfortable truths remained obscured. Over time, repetition solidified this selective memory, transforming omission into tradition. The absence of certain voices became normal, their erasure accepted as the natural order of things. Power relied on this forgetting, drawing strength from the gaps it created. Within these walls, power, race, and silence reinforced one another, forming a closed loop that resisted disruption. Authority justified inequality, inequality demanded silence, and silence preserved authority. Breaking this cycle required more than individual courage. It required dismantling the structures that made silence necessary. Yet for those living inside the system, such transformation remained abstract, overshadowed by the immediate demands of survival and obedience, leaving the contradictions unresolved as daily life continued, shaped by unspoken rules, inherited fears, and a hierarchy that remained firmly in place, while history moved forward without pausing to question what was hidden behind the walls where power spoke loudly to the nation, and quietly to those whose voices were never meant to be heard or recorded, or acknowledged as part of the story that continued to unfold, without interruption or accountability, or recognition of the lives constrained within that space. The silence endured and the structure remained intact and unchallenged within the routines that defined each day and each interaction, and each decision made in rooms where some voices mattered, and others were expected to disappear into the background as if they had never existed at all.
The marriage presented to the public was carefully arranged to communicate stability, respectability, and order, a union that appeared to embody the ideals expected of a leader's household. From the outside, it looked disciplined and proper, a partnership rooted in shared status and social expectation rather than emotional transparency. Every public appearance reinforced this image, teaching the nation how to see them and what to believe. The wife fulfilled her role with precision, representing refinement, loyalty, and restraint, while the husband benefited from the legitimacy her presence provided. Together they formed a symbol that reassured society that power rested in capable and moral hands. Yet this marriage was less a private bond than a public contract shaped by inheritance, reputation, and obligation. Affection was secondary to duty, and personal fulfillment was often sacrificed to preserve appearances. Within elite societies, such arrangements were understood and rarely questioned. What mattered was not intimacy but alignment, the merging of families, resources, and influence in ways that strengthened existing hierarchy. The marriage functioned as a stabilizing force for the man's career, offering a shield against scrutiny and a framework through which his authority could be trusted and admired. Beneath this surface, fear operated quietly, shaping choices and limiting possibility. The wife's position depended on maintaining the marriage's image, even when that image concealed profound betrayal. Acknowledging what existed beyond the public narrative risked humiliation, loss of status, and social isolation. The cost of truth was too high, and so silence became a form of self-preservation. Within the rigid expectations placed upon women of her class, endurance was valued more than confrontation, discretion more than justice. Her role required restraint, not only in public but in private, training her to manage pain without disrupting the structure that sustained her position. The secret that bound this marriage was not shared openly, yet it exerted constant pressure. It existed in what was not discussed, in the careful avoidance of certain topics, in the emotional distance that replaced trust. Fear of scandal shaped daily life, dictating behavior and limiting expression. The wife learned to navigate this reality by focusing on duty, channeling her energy into socially acceptable roles that diverted attention from what could not be acknowledged. Her silence was interpreted as composure, her endurance mistaken for content. For the husband, the marriage provided cover. It allowed him to project morality while pursuing desires that contradicted the very values his household symbolized. The structure of the marriage did not restrain him, it protected him. Society assumed that a man anchored by a respectable wife was disciplined and honorable, an assumption that granted him freedom rather than accountability. The imbalance of consequences was stark. His actions hidden behind the facade of marriage carried little risk, while exposure threatened the wife far more than it threatened him. Fear extended beyond personal reputation to legal and financial realities. Property, inheritance, and lineage depended on maintaining clear boundaries. The marriage ensured legitimacy, securing wealth and status for recognized heirs while rendering other lives invisible. This separation was enforced by law, turning private betrayal into a protected arrangement. The wife's role in preserving this order was implicit. By remaining silent, she helped uphold a system that prioritized stability over truth, continuity over compassion. Within the household, this dynamic shaped relationships in subtle ways. Emotional distance replaced intimacy. Routine substituted for connection. Interactions were governed by caution, each aware of what could not be said. The marriage continued, not because it was fulfilling but because it was necessary. Necessity became its own justification, convincing those involved that endurance was preferable to disruption. Over time, this logic hardened into acceptance, making the secret feel permanent and unchangeable. The fear of exposure influenced every decision. Public events were carefully managed, correspondence guarded, explanations rehearsed. Any deviation from expected behavior carried the risk of drawing attention. The household became a controlled environment, where spontaneity was discouraged, and predictability valued. The wife's presence at the husband's side served as reassurance, a visual reminder that order prevailed. Her role was to embody calm, to deflect suspicion through normalcy, to make the extraordinary appear ordinary. This marriage also reflected broader social expectations that constrained women's agency. A wife's identity was inseparable from her husband's reputation. Challenging him publicly would have marked her as disloyal, irrational or vindictive, labels that could destroy her standing. The social script offered no space for addressing betrayal without self-destruction. Silence, therefore, was not weakness but survival, a calculated response to a system that punished women for speaking truths that inconvenienced powerful men. The secret that bound them was asymmetric. The husband could compartmentalize, separating his public duties from his private actions without facing internal or external reckoning. The wife, however, lived with the knowledge daily, its weight shaping her thoughts and behavior. Fear did not dissipate with time. It became ingrained, a constant awareness that the stability of her world rested on her willingness to endure. The marriage persisted not through mutual trust, but through mutual dependence on appearances. In this arrangement, love was irrelevant. What mattered was preservation. The marriage functioned as a barrier against chaos, a structure that kept power intact. The wife's role was to hold that barrier steady, even as it concealed injustice. Her silence was interpreted as consent, her endurance as virtue. Society rewarded this performance, reinforcing the idea that order justified sacrifice. The fear that sustained the marriage was shared by those around them as well. Friends, relatives, and allies understood the state. Intervening or acknowledging the truth threatened not only one household but an entire network of interests. Silence became collective, a shared investment in stability. The marriage thus served a larger purpose, anchoring a system that depended on selective truth and controlled narrative. Over time, repetition normalized this arrangement. What began as a conscious choice hardened into habit. The marriage continued because it had always continued, because changing it seemed impossible. Fear of scandal, fear of loss, fear of disruption fused into a single force that governed behavior. The secret remained unspoken, not because it was forgotten but because remembering it openly would have required dismantling the structure that gave meaning and security to everyone involved. Leaving the marriage intact as a public symbol while privately it functioned as a boundary, a shield, and a silent agreement built on endurance, restraint, and the unspoken understanding that some truths were too dangerous to name, and therefore had to be carried quietly within the confines of a relationship that existed as much for society as it did for the individuals bound within it and continued to exist, through repetition and fear rather than trust or honesty or acknowledgement of the reality that shaped every interaction and every choice within that union. 6 children entered the world carrying a legacy they were never allowed to claim, born into a system that defined them not by blood but by law. Their existence was shaped before they could speak, their futures determined by rules that reduced human identity to legal status. Though their father was one of the most powerful men in the nation, his name could not protect them, it could not free them, could not legitimize them, could not acknowledge them. Instead, it hovered over their lives as an unspoken presence, a truth everyone around them understood yet refused to recognize openly. From the moment they were born, these children were classified according to their mother's condition, not their father's power. The law was precise and unforgiving. The status of the mother determined the fate of the child. This single rule ensured that wealth, property, and privilege flowed in one direction, while bondage reproduced itself across generations. Bloodlines meant nothing if they threatened the social order. The children's resemblance to their father, their intelligence, their mannerisms, even their proximity to him could not override the legal fiction that erased him from their identities. Growing up within the household, they inhabited a strange and painful contradiction. They were close enough to power to see it clearly, yet barred from accessing it. They watched their father move freely through spaces they were forbidden to enter as equal. They observed the privileges extended to legitimate heirs,
learning early what separated them from those children despite the shared ancestry. This daily exposure to inequality was not abstract, it was lived, felt and internalized. Each interaction reinforced the lesson that truth alone did not grant rights. Their childhoods unfolded under constant surveillance. As enslaved individuals, they were expected to obey, to serve and to remain invisible, even as their very presence challenged the boundaries the household worked so hard to maintain. Any sign of favoritism risked exposure. Any display of affection threatened the fragile structure of denial. As a result, distance replaced acknowledgement, discipline substituted for recognition. The children learned to interpret subtle cues, to understand when proximity was dangerous, and when absence was safer. Names carried weight, and theirs were carefully chosen to avoid association. They bore no public connection to their father, no official record that linked them to his lineage. This absence was deliberate. To name them openly would have required confronting the contradiction at the heart of the household and the nation. It would have forced recognition of relationships that violated the racial and legal hierarchies upon which power depended. Instead, the children existed in a liminal space, known privately but denied publicly, present but unclaimed. Education and opportunity were similarly restricted. Any sign of advancement risked drawing attention, challenging assumptions about who deserved development and who did not. The children's potential had to be managed carefully, nurtured quietly or suppressed entirely depending on circumstance. Intelligence could be dangerous if it contradicted prevailing myths about racial inferiority. Ambition could invite punishment if it threatened to blur boundaries. Survival often required minimizing oneself, learning when to excel and when to retreat. Their mother's position offered no protection beyond what she could negotiate within the limits imposed upon her. Motherhood did not grant her authority over her children's future. She could not legally free them, could not secure their inheritance, could not even ensure they would remain with her. The constant threat of separation loomed over daily life, shaping relationships through fear rather than stability. Love existed, but it existed under constraint, expressed cautiously in a world where attachment could be weaponized. The children's awareness of their father's identity grew over time, formed through observation rather than explanation. They saw how others deferred to him, how decisions flowed from his authority, how his presence altered the atmosphere of a room. They understood that his power extended everywhere except to them. This understanding did not require explicit acknowledgement, it was embedded in routine. The absence of his name in their lives spoke louder than any confession could have. As they grew older, the contradiction became harder to bear. Adolescence brought heightened awareness of self and status, sharpening the pain of exclusion. They understood what was being denied to them and why. The law that erased their father's name also erased their claim to protection, inheritance, and recognition. It rendered them vulnerable not only to exploitation but to historical oblivion. Without acknowledgement, their stories risked disappearing entirely, absorbed into the anonymity imposed by enslavement. The household's efforts to manage this reality extended to the wider society. Outsiders might notice similarities but discretion prevailed. The children were explained away through silence or convenient assumptions. No one asked questions that might disrupt the illusion of order. This collective avoidance reinforced the children's marginalization, teaching them that their truth was dangerous not because it was false, but because it was destabilizing. Their lives unfolded within a narrow corridor of possibility. Some were assigned skilled labor, others domestic roles, all carefully calibrated to maintain control. Any gesture toward autonomy required negotiation, patience and often compromise. Freedom, if it came at all, arrived late and incomplete, shaped by conditions that limited movement, employment and security. Even when legal status changed, the stigma attached to their origins followed them, a reminder that the denial of a father's name had consequences that extended beyond bondage. Memory became their inheritance. Lacking formal recognition, they carried their history through stories passed quietly, through shared understanding rather than official record. These memories preserved what the law erased, sustaining a sense of identity that refused to disappear entirely. Yet memory alone could not restore what had been taken. It could not grant legitimacy in a society structured to deny it. The denial of their father's name served a broader purpose. It protected the myth of moral authority at the top, allowing power to present itself as virtuous, while relying on systems that contradicted its ideals. The children became collateral in this arrangement, their lives shaped by the need to preserve appearance. Their suffering was not incidental, it was structural, embedded in laws designed to prioritize order over justice. As time passed, the children moved through different stages of life, carrying the weight of unacknowledged lineage. Their identities were shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was given. The absence of a name influenced how they saw themselves and how others treated them. It limited their claims on the future, narrowing the paths available to them. Yet their existence persisted, resisting erasure through sheer presence. History would later struggle to account for them, piecing together fragments left behind in records not meant to tell their full story. Their lives challenged the simplicity of heroic narratives, complicating the image of leadership by revealing its hidden costs. The denial they experienced was not an anomaly, but a feature of a system that depended on selective recognition. They lived with the knowledge that their father's power could have changed everything, yet never did. This awareness shaped their understanding of authority, teaching them that power did not automatically confer responsibility or compassion. It taught them that justice was not inherent in leadership, but contingent on choice. Their lives unfolded within this lesson, marked by resilience forged under constraint. The 6 children moved through a world that refused to see them fully, carrying a truth that could not be spoken openly. Their identities were fragmented by law, their lineage split between what was known and what was denied. They grew, worked, endured and remembered, their lives woven into the fabric of a nation that benefited from their silence while celebrating the name that could never be theirs, leaving them to navigate existence with an inheritance defined not by recognition but by absence, by proximity without belonging, by a legacy that shaped every aspect of their lives while remaining officially unnamed and unresolved within the structures that governed them, and continued to do so as generations passed, and the weight of that denial followed them into every moment without release or acknowledgement or closure, as their story remained suspended within the space between truth and erasure, where their father's name existed only as an unspoken shadow over lives that carried his blood, but not his identity. The family history of the First Lady was a carefully guarded narrative, presented as a lineage of respectability, refinement, and social influence. It was a story designed to reinforce the legitimacy of the household, and, by extension, the authority of the president himself. From public appearances to private correspondence, every detail that could be known about her family was curated to project stability, morality and adherence to societal norms. Yet beneath this polished surface lay a reality that contradicted the image the family worked so diligent to maintain, a hidden chapter that threatened to unravel the very foundation of the household's reputation if it were ever revealed. Her sister, the woman whose life was constrained by slavery, existed within this family orbit, yet outside its privileges. Their shared ancestry was undeniable, yet it was deliberately obscured in public memory and social record. The First Lady's family history became a tool for both inclusion and exclusion, defining who belonged and who was relegated to the margin. Blood ties did not guarantee protection. Instead, the lines of inheritance and legal status dictated a hierarchy that separated sister from sister, transforming familial bonds into instruments of control. The contrast between public narrative and private reality was stark, highlighting how societal expectations could manipulate the perception of family and loyalty. The First Lady herself operated within these constraints, navigating the complex interplay of duty, reputation and secrecy. She was aware of the differences between her life and her sister's, yet acknowledgement was impossible without endangering her own position and that of her children. Family history was not merely an academic curiosity, it was an active mechanism that shaped daily life, guiding behavior, controlling access, and determining which truths could be spoken and which had to remain silent. The narrative she inherited and perpetuated reinforced a system that preserved privilege while denying humanity, illustrating how law, custom and social expectation intersected to maintain power. The invisible boundary between the sisters created a tension that defined household dynamics. On one side was authority, security and recognition, on the other subjugation, labor, and enforced invisibility. The First Lady's family history was instrumental in maintaining this distinction, providing justification for the inequality that existed under the same roof. Social norms supported the idea that a woman of status could enjoy protection and respect, while an enslaved relative, even one of the closest blood relation, was subject to legal and societal control. This dichotomy was not a moral failing of individuals alone but a structural feature of a society that used family narratives to reinforce hierarchy. The concealment of this history extended beyond the household into the public sphere. Guests, politicians and allies were presented with a carefully constructed image, one that emphasized refinement and virtue while masking the realities of slavery and coercion. Family history was packaged as evidence of stability and moral integrity, a tool to inspire confidence and admiration. Meanwhile, the existence of an enslaved sister and her children remained unspoken, erased from memory, and shielded from scrutiny. This deliberate omission illustrates how personal narratives were weaponized to protect public perception, ensuring that inconvenient truths remained buried. The children of the enslaved sister complicated this family history further. They were living proof of the contradictions the household sought to conceal, reminders that power and privilege were exercised at the expense of those who could not defend themselves. The First Lady's family narrative, designed to project virtue, had to accommodate their presence without acknowledging their origins. This required careful management, subtle gestures and tacit agreements that preserved appearances while denying recognition. It was a constant negotiation between truth and image, a balancing act that shaped every interaction within the household. Family history also served as a social shield. By emphasizing lineage, property and social connections, the household could deflect questions, neutralize potential scandal, and assert authority. The narrative of refinement allowed the First Lady and her associates to maintain moral credibility, even as private actions contradicted public ideals. The contrast between the celebrated family history and the hidden reality of enslavement underscores the complexity of power in a society where reputation was currency and secrecy was essential. This concealment extended across generations. Stories of virtue, loyalty and service were passed down, while the experiences of the enslaved were omitted. Memory was curated, selective, and deliberate, preserving the myth of moral excellence while silencing the voices of those whose lives had been shaped by oppression. The family history that was taught, repeated and celebrated functioned not only as a record of the past but as an instrument of control, reinforcing social hierarchies and conditioning subsequent generations to accept inequality as natural. Legal structures reinforced this selective history. Laws of inheritance, property and race codified distinctions between those recognized and those denied. Family narratives became intertwined with legal realities, ensuring that the privileges of some were maintained at the expense of others. The First Lady's family history therefore was both story and strategy, a tool to protect wealth, status and influence while ensuring that the presence of the enslaved sister and her children could not disrupt the carefully curated image of virtue within the household. Daily life reflected these divisions. The First Lady moved through rooms with authority and visibility, while her sister remained constrained by expectations of service and silence. The invisible barrier defined interactions, creating a psychological landscape in which power, loyalty and obedience were constantly negotiated. Family history dictated behavior, shaping not only what could be said but also what could be imagined. The enslaved sister's existence was acknowledged only indirectly, its recognition constrained by fear, legality and social norms, ensuring that the family's public narrative remained unchallenged. Education, social exposure and access were also influenced by this family history. The First Lady's children were provided opportunities that reinforced privilege, while the children of the enslaved sister were restricted, their potential circumscribed by both law and custom. This unequal distribution of opportunity maintained the household's image and reinforced the broader social hierarchy. The history told, and the history hidden shaped how each generation understood its place in the world, embedding inequality into the very fabric of family life. Even within private spaces, the weight of family history was present. Conversations, gestures and routines were informed by the need to protect reputation and maintain secrecy. The First Lady's awareness of the enslaved sister's proximity created a constant tension between kinship and social expectation, a tension that required careful management and constant vigilance. Every decision, who could speak, who could be seen, how attention was directed, was shaped by this duality, ensuring that the household's public face remained unblemished, while private realities persisted in silence. Memory and narrative became tools of both empowerment and erasure. The family's celebrated history preserved authority, social standing and legitimacy, while simultaneously erasing evidence of injustice. Stories were told selectively, creating a landscape in which virtue could be performed even as exploitation continued. The enslaved sister and her children were relegated to the margins, their experiences preserved only in fragments and whispers. This duality highlights how family history can be both a weapon and a shield, shaping perception while controlling the record of reality. The First Lady's family history also reveals the broader societal mechanisms that protected privilege. By constructing a narrative of respectability and virtue, the household ensured that its actions were insulated from scrutiny. Law, custom and social expectation converged to make secrecy sustainable. The presence of the enslaved sister challenged this narrative, but the weight of collective silence, fear, and legal protection rendered acknowledgement impossible. Family history became both a performance and a defense, a way to assert moral authority while avoiding the consequences of private truth. Even after generations had passed, the selective memory embedded in this family history continued to shape perception. Public records, biographies and social narratives preserved an image of refinement and legitimacy while leaving the experiences of the enslaved largely invisible. This enduring erasure underscores the power of narrative to influence not only contemporaneous understanding but also historical memory. What was left unsaid, omitted, and concealed became as consequential as the stories that were told, ensuring that the family's public image remained untarnished even as the hidden truths persisted in private and in memory. The First Lady's family history was therefore not merely a record of ancestry. It was a carefully maintained instrument of control. It defined who mattered, who could be acknowledged, and who had to remain invisible. It shaped daily interactions, guided decisions about behavior and speech, and influenced the distribution of opportunity and protection within the household. It was a tool that allowed the preservation of power, privilege, and reputation, while simultaneously erasing the experiences of those whose lives were most directly shaped by the inequities the narrative concealed, ensuring that the contradictions at the heart of the household could continue to exist without exposure, resolution, or acknowledgement.
The laws of the time were unambiguous in their cruelty, codifying a system that allowed the powerful to act without accountability while rendering the lives of others legally invisible. They dictated that property, wealth, and status flowed through lines of privilege, and that the identity of a child was determined not by who fathered it, but by who owned the mother. These statutes provided a framework that protected the private actions of the president, enabling him to maintain control over his household while avoiding public scrutiny. The children born from his relationship with his wife's enslaved sister were rendered legally non-existent in terms of paternal acknowledgement, their status entirely dependent on their mother's condition. The law did not recognize their humanity in full, but it did ensure that they could be contained, managed, and directed in ways that preserved the power structure. For the president, this legal framework was a shield. It allowed him to navigate the public sphere as a moral and respected figure, while exercising authority over lives that could not challenge him. He could engage in relationships and produce children without fearing legal repercussions or societal backlash because the law had predetermined the consequences in his favor. This legal protection transformed what might have been scandal into a silent arrangement, a reality that existed within the household yet could not be confronted outside it. The disparity between law and morality was stark, yet the law sanctioned it, rendering the private truth almost impossible to dispute. The children themselves were bound by these statutes from the moment of birth. Their identities, futures, and opportunities were determined not by their lineage or capabilities, but by the status imposed upon them by inheritance of their mother's enslavement. They could inherit neither wealth nor recognition, and their survival required navigating a world that constantly reminded them of the boundaries imposed upon them. Any assertion of claim toward their father or the privileges he enjoyed would have been meaningless in the eyes of the law, reinforcing a system in which power could exist without responsibility, and in which injustice could be perpetuated with impunity. The laws also shaped social perception. Enslaved children were expected to occupy spaces and perform roles that reinforced the social order. Their labor, presence, and existence were instrumental to maintaining a facade of propriety and functionality within elite households. While their resemblance to the president could not be entirely hidden, the law ensured that it had no bearing on their social or legal standing. This gap between biological reality and legal recognition created a dissonance that defined daily life, forcing the children, their mother, and the household to negotiate existence within the strictures of law rather than justice. For the First Lady and her family, the law functioned as both shield and constraint. It protected the household's reputation while simultaneously defining the limits of familial responsibility. Her sister and the children were legally property, not kin in the eyes of the state, a fact that dictated every interaction and shaped every decision. The legal system thus reinforced social hierarchies, ensuring that power remained concentrated while moral contradictions could be safely ignored. Family loyalty, affection, or recognition existed only at the discretion of those who wielded authority, and the law provided the justification for withholding it. The broader societal implications of these laws were profound. They created a world in which private actions by the powerful could be insulated from scrutiny, a society in which rights and freedoms were distributed selectively based on race and status. The president's ability to maintain a dual existence, respected public leader and private exploiter, was made possible by legal codes that ignored moral accountability. These statutes not only protected his actions, but also shaped the experiences of those under his control, ensuring that inequality was embedded in daily life and in the very structures of governance. Children born under these conditions learned early to navigate the boundaries imposed upon them. They understood that their existence was legally circumscribed, that recognition, freedom, and opportunity were conditional, and that claiming what was denied by law could invite danger. Their identities were shaped as by restriction as by nurture, as much by absence as by presence. Law dictated not only their social position but their psychological landscape, teaching lessons about power, invisibility, and endurance that would persist throughout their lives. The mother's agency was similarly constrained. Although she had deep knowledge of her children's paternity and an awareness of the injustice they faced, The law denied her the means to alter their status. She could not claim protection, inheritance, or recognition for them, and any attempt to assert such claims would have conflicted directly with statutes designed to maintain the social order. Her choices were limited to endurance, negotiation, and survival within a framework that afforded her minimal leverage. This legal reality shaped the household's power dynamics, reinforcing hierarchies that relied on the subjugation of some to protect the authority of others. Even those tasked with observing or documenting life within the household were constrained by law. Records, diaries, and correspondence often reflect selective acknowledgement, highlighting achievements in lineage deemed socially acceptable while omitting evidence that could disrupt legal or social hierarchy. The statutes governing slavery and inheritance provided both a lens and a limitation for historians, shaping what could be recorded, remembered, or acknowledged. Legal frameworks dictated not only daily life but the memory of that life, ensuring that the stories of marginalized individuals remained fragmentary and mediated by those in power. The persistence of these laws across time also ensured intergenerational consequence. Children of enslaved women remained bound by their mother's legal status long after their immediate circumstances changed, reinforcing systemic inequality. Legal definitions created inherited limitations, ensuring that privilege and property remained concentrated and that social mobility for marginalized individuals was tightly constrained. The law thus functioned as both a protective mechanism for the powerful and an instrument of control over those denied power, cementing social hierarchies into the very structure of society. Within the White House, these laws enabled a duality that would have been otherwise impossible. The president could maintain public respect while privately exercising authority unchecked, insulated from moral or social consequence. The children existed in the same household as their father, yet without legal acknowledgement, their lives shaped by statutes that prioritized the preservation of status and property over human recognition. Law dictated boundaries, protected reputations, and silenced potential challenges, reinforcing the structure of power through codified inequality. The long-term impact of these statutes extended beyond the immediate household. They provided a precedent for selective recognition, shaping societal norms regarding who could be acknowledged, who could claim identity, and who could access resources. The children's exclusion from recognition was legally sanctioned, their invisibility maintained through statutes that reinforced the broader system of racial and social hierarchy. The law's authority was absolute, determining not only what was permissible but also what could be imagined as possible within the constraints of social order. The enforcement of these laws was deliberate and meticulous. Household managers, allies, and social networks operated with awareness of legal boundaries, ensuring that actions conformed to statutes and that visibility of potential violations was minimized. Compliance was maintained through a combination of routine, expectation, and fear, all undergirded by the legitimacy conferred by the law. Every interaction, every assignment, and every restriction was justified within this legal framework, allowing the household to function while concealing the moral contradictions that existed at its core. The children, their mother, and the household staff lived under the constant awareness that law defined their reality. The statutes determined behavior, access, and recognition, creating a structured environment in which power and subjugation coexisted. The president's authority was amplified by legal sanction, while those subjected to it learned to navigate the boundaries it imposed. These boundaries were not abstract. They were lived, internalized, and reinforced daily, shaping identities, relationships, and experiences in ways that left long-lasting impacts. In every sense, the law was both a protector and an enforcer. It shielded the powerful from accountability, codified the subjugation of the vulnerable, and dictated the social order within the household and the broader society. Children born into this system were denied acknowledgement, their lives predetermined by statutes designed to preserve hierarchy. Mothers were constrained, relationships mediated, and moral contradictions rendered invisible. Law created a structure that allowed private exploitation to coexist with public virtue, ensuring that appearances could be maintained while inequality persisted, leaving the consequences of these statutes to ripple across generations and embedding a legacy of silence, control, and unacknowledged truth that shaped every interaction, every identity, and every life connected to the household and its concealed realities. Generations of those affected by this hidden truth lived their lives under the shadow of secrecy, carrying with them the consequences of actions that were never acknowledged publicly. The children born to the enslaved sister were denied recognition, inheritance, and identity in a society that depended on the concealment of such truths. Their lives unfolded in a world where what was visible to outsiders did not reflect the reality they experienced daily. They grew up understanding that certain things were forbidden to speak aloud, that their lineage was dangerous knowledge, and that any claim to legitimacy would be met with denial or hostility. This awareness,
shaped not only their daily interactions but their understanding of self, family, and the larger social world. As these children matured, the legacy of denial continued to define their place in society. Their legal status, determined by their mother, ensured that they remained bound to the system that had subjugated her, limiting their mobility and autonomy. Education, opportunity, and protection were contingent on the discretion of those in power, and even within the confines of the household, they had to navigate a delicate balance between visibility and invisibility. Their resemblance to the father they could not claim intensified the tension, making it impossible to ignore their existence while simultaneously prohibiting acknowledgement. The household operated on the understanding that certain truths must remain unspoken, a principle that governed relationships, behavior, and expectations across generations. This enforced silence extended beyond the immediate household to the broader social networks surrounding them. Friends, neighbors, and political allies were all aware, in varying degrees, of the discrepancies between public image and private reality, yet social norms dictated discretion, ensuring that what could destabilize authority remained invisible in public discourse. The consequences of exposure were severe: reputations could be destroyed, alliances fractured, and social order threatened. These risks reinforced the need for secrecy, embedding it as a principle not only within the household but throughout the community. The children, aware of these dynamics, learned to navigate their lives cautiously, understanding the cost of acknowledgement and the protective power of silence. Over time, the impact of this hidden truth extended into identity formation. Children grew up with a fragmented sense of self, knowing that their existence was simultaneously real and denied. Their understanding of family was complicated by legal definitions, societal expectations, and the deliberate omissions of those around them. They inherited both the advantages and limitations imposed by proximity to power, yet were denied the full benefits of lineage. This duality shaped their aspirations, relationships, and perceptions of justice, creating a psychological landscape marked by resilience, caution, and an acute awareness of the boundaries imposed upon them by birth. The weight of unacknowledged history also affected subsequent generations. The knowledge of lineage, if transmitted through oral history, became a source of both pride and burden. It represented connection to power and influence, yet carried with it the reality of marginalization, exclusion, and vulnerability. Descendants inherited stories fragmented by secrecy, learning of relationships that had been legally and socially erased, and adapting these stories into personal and communal identity. Memory served as both preservation and resistance, ensuring that truth survived even when law, society, and public narrative sought to erase it. Within the household, the dynamics of secrecy and denial shaped every interaction. Children learned early to read the expressions, tones, and unspoken rules that governed behavior. They understood when to remain silent, when to step back, and when to assert themselves cautiously. Survival depended on these skills as much as on obedience or labor. The presence of their father, visible yet legally inaccessible, complicated these lessons. They had to reconcile the knowledge of biological connection with the reality of denial, a tension that influenced emotional development, social understanding, and the ways in which they related to authority figures. The mother's role was central in navigating this intergenerational legacy. She transmitted knowledge, taught caution, and provided care within the constraints imposed by law and society. Her ability to protect her children relied on discretion, negotiation, and an intimate understanding of the power dynamics surrounding them. She became both a guardian and a guide, ensuring that the children could survive and, when possible, thrive despite systemic denial. Her life and actions illustrate the ways in which resilience is forged under constraint, and how the survival of marginalized individuals often depends on strategic silence, careful observation, and the negotiation of dangerous truth. Legal and social systems reinforced this invisibility across generations. Children born under these circumstances were denied recognition, inheritance, and societal validation, effectively ensuring that the consequences of secrecy persisted beyond the immediate household. Even as laws evolved and formal slavery was abolished, the legacy of denial left enduring marks on identity, opportunity, and social mobility. The structure of exclusion created an inheritance of marginalization, shaping lives in ways that were often invisible to contemporaries and historians alike. Memory became the primary vehicle through which truth persisted. Stories passed down quietly, through whispers or careful recounting, preserved connections that law and society had attempted to erase. Oral histories and private narratives ensured that the reality of lineage, family bonds, and lived experiences remained accessible to those willing to listen, even as public acknowledgement remained impossible. This form of resistance allowed the descendants to claim a sense of belonging and identity, despite the official erasure of their parentage and the deliberate concealment of their existence in public narratives. The hidden truth also had psychological and social consequences for the children. Growing up denied acknowledgement of their parentage, they learned to negotiate shame, secrecy, and resilience. Their social interactions were influenced by the need to manage perception, conceal identity and navigate authority. The duality of their lives, existing as both kin to power and marginalized subjects, shaped self-perception, aspirations and relationships. They had to reconcile pride and lineage with the reality of denial, creating complex identities that balanced inherited knowledge with lived experience. Education and opportunity were mediated by these dynamics. The children's access to learning, skill development and social mobility was constrained by the interplay of legal status and societal expectation. They were permitted to exist in spaces where observation did not threaten hierarchy, but any step toward recognition or assertion of identity risked exposure and consequence. These limitations shaped their choices, fostering careful calculation, patience, and adaptability as survival strategy. Despite these constraints, some aspects of resilience and resistance persisted. Knowledge, memory and connection provided the children with tools to navigate life under denial. Even in the absence of legal acknowledgement, familial bonds, stories and the understanding of lineage offered a sense of continuity and identity. The preservation of these truths ensured that, while public acknowledgement remained impossible, private acknowledgement and self-awareness persisted, creating a foundation for intergenerational survival and adaptation. The implications of living under secrecy also extended to relationships outside the household. Friendships, alliances and communal interactions were mediated by the need to protect identity and family history. Children learned to trust selectively, to manage disclosure and to interpret the intentions of others carefully. Social navigation became an essential skill, reflecting the broader dynamics of power, recognition and denial in their world. Generations were therefore shaped not only by law and social expectation, but by the legacy of secrecy itself. The need to survive within an imposed structure of denial influenced identity formation, social interactions and psychological resilience. The hidden truth remained a constant, guiding decisions, shaping relationships, and informing strategies for living in a society that refused recognition, while simultaneously benefiting from proximity to power. Memory, resilience and careful negotiation became essential tools, ensuring continuity and survival despite systemic erasure and the ongoing influence of structures that prioritized appearance over truth and power over justice, and leaving generations to carry the consequences of a story that could not be acknowledged openly, but continued to shape their existence in profound, lasting ways. The moral contradictions embedded in the household created a persistent tension that defined daily life, shaping relationships, decisions and perceptions of justice. The president's position as both a public symbol of virtue and a private participant in exploitation was facilitated by societal structures that allowed these contradictions to coexist without accountability. Those living within the household were forced to navigate this dual reality, understanding that appearances were paramount, and that deviation from expected roles could have severe consequences. The enslaved sister and her children occupied a precarious space, visible yet invisible, acknowledged in private but denied in law and society, their lives governed by the tension between proximity to power and systemic exclusion. The First Lady's awareness of these dynamics shaped her role within the household. She understood that maintaining the image of stability required discretion, endurance and careful management of relationships. Her authority, while real in some domestic matters, was circumscribed by societal expectation and law, leaving her limited in her ability to intervene or protect her sister and nieces and nephews. Every choice she made was mediated by the tension between familial obligation and social constraint, between the desire to acknowledge truth and the necessity of preserving appearances. Her actions illustrate the complex negotiation required of women in positions of both influence and limitation, balancing personal knowledge with public expectation. The children of the enslaved sister grew up under constant surveillance, learning early the rules that governed their existence. They had to understand who could be trusted, what behaviors were safe, and how to navigate spaces dominated by authority figures who controlled their lives. Their daily experiences were structured around obedience, vigilance and the careful management of visibility. The duality of their existence, biologically related to power yet legally and socially marginalized, shaped their understanding of justice, authority and personal agency. Each moment was a lesson in negotiation, endurance and the complexities of survival within a system designed to deny them acknowledgement. Proximity to power did not equate to protection. The children could observe their father, experience his presence and even recognize traits inherited from him, yet these observations did not confer legal rights, social standing or recognition. The cognitive dissonance of being intimately connected to influence while being excluded from its benefits created emotional and psychological tension. They learned that identity could be both present and denied, that reality could exist without recognition, and that survival often depended on the strategic management of knowledge, expression and behavior. Within the broader household, the dynamics of secrecy shaped social norms and interactions. Staff, family members and visitors all participated in a system of selective acknowledgement, consciously or unconsciously reinforcing boundaries of visibility, power, and legitimate. Silence was enforced not only by law, but by social expectation, and complicity became necessary for survival. Those who deviated risked both personal and social consequences, teaching successive generations that discretion, observation, and careful negotiation were essential skills. These norms extended beyond individual households, reflecting societal mechanisms that allowed private exploitation to persist under the guise of propriety and order. The laws and customs of the time reinforced this tension, codifying inequality and ensuring that power remained concentrated. Legal definitions of slavery, inheritance and legitimacy determined the status of every child born in the household, shaping access to resources, social mobility and recognition. The children's lives were constrained by statutes designed to maintain hierarchy, while those in authority benefited from protection and insulation. The legal framework provided justification for denial and invisibility, enabling moral contradictions to persist without challenge and reinforcing the separation between public virtue and private exploitation. Memory, both personal and collective, became a tool of survival and resistance. The mother and children preserved knowledge of their lineage, experiences and relationships through oral history, quiet recollection and careful communication. These memories ensured continuity of identity despite systemic denial, providing a sense of self and belonging that was otherwise denied by law and society. Memory functioned as a counterbalance to erasure, allowing the children and their descendants to claim connection and heritage, even in the absence of legal acknowledgement or public recognition. Education, opportunity and social advancement were mediated by these moral and legal contradictions. While the children were intimately connected to power, they were denied the benefits that proximity might have conferred. Their development skills and opportunities were constrained by social expectation and the necessity of remaining invisible in key ways. Any attempt to assert identity or claim recognition risked exposure, punishment or social ostracism. This environment required careful navigation, teaching lessons in adaptability, caution and the complex interplay between presence, denial and survival. The broader societal context amplified these dynamics. Communities, allies and observers often recognized discrepancies between public image and private reality, yet social norms dictated that these truths remain unspoken. The preservation of power and reputation relied on collective silence, ensuring that moral contradictions could persist without disruption. The household became a microcosm of society at large, where authority was protected, exploitation was hidden and appearance was paramount. The children's understanding of these dynamics shaped their perceptions of social hierarchy, justice and the consequences of truth-telling. Emotional resilience emerged as a key aspect of navigating these contradictions. Children learned to reconcile pride and biological connection with the reality of social exclusion. They developed strategies for managing secrecy, interpreting social cues, and negotiating interactions with authority. Psychological endurance became a necessary survival skill, providing stability in a world where law, custom and social expectation consistently denied acknowledgement. The balance between private knowledge and public invisibility shaped their identities, teaching lessons about agency, adaptation and the nature of power. The First Lady's position further complicated these dynamics. She embodied both authority and limitation, navigating the tension between familial responsibility and societal her management of the household, her interactions with the president, and her engagement with her sister and nieces and nephews were all shaped by the need to maintain appearances. Her authority was constrained by law and custom, yet she had influence over domestic operations and daily life. These constraints required strategic thinking, careful discretion, and negotiation between moral awareness and social survival.
The intersection of law, family and morality created a framework in which contradictions could coexist. The president's authority, protected by statutes and reinforced by social norms, allowed private exploitation to occur without consequence. The children's proximity to power did not confer benefit, but instead heightened the tension between visibility and denial. The household operated as a carefully managed system, balancing acknowledgement and invisibility, moral awareness and social expectation, knowledge and silence. Each individual's actions were shaped by these intersecting forces, illustrating the complexity of navigating life within structures that prioritized power over justice. Intergenerational impact was profound. The lessons learned by the children in navigating moral and social contradictions informed their understanding of identity, authority, and survival. Knowledge of lineage, even when unacknowledged publicly, shaped personal and familial strategies, influencing decisions about education, relationships, and community engagement. The persistence of denial and invisibility created long-lasting effects, teaching resilience while simultaneously perpetuating the consequences of secrecy and systemic inequality. Social interactions within the household reflected these tensions. Staff, relatives, and visitors all navigated the boundaries of acknowledgement, understanding that deviation from prescribed roles could have consequences. The children learned to interpret subtle cues, manage visibility, and negotiate relationships with care. The moral contradictions of the household were embedded in every gesture, conversation, and expectation, shaping daily life and long-term development in ways that were often invisible to outsiders but profoundly influential to those living within the system. Ultimately, the coexistence of power and denial, visibility and invisibility, acknowledgement and erasure defined the lived experience of the children. They inhabited a space in which biological connection, social hierarchy, and legal status intersected in complex and often painful ways. Their identity was shaped by these forces, teaching lessons about survival, resilience, and adaptation. Memory, discretion, and strategic action became essential tools for navigating a world in which moral contradictions were normalized and where proximity to power offered both insight and limitation. The household's careful management of these contradictions ensured that public perception remained undisturbed. Appearances of virtue and stability masked private realities of exploitation and denial. The children's experiences, though shaped by biological connection, were constrained by law and social expectation. Their understanding of authority, identity, and morality was formed within this context, teaching lessons about endurance, and the complexities of survival under conditions where truth could be dangerous, and acknowledgement could be denied indefinitely, leaving a legacy of secrecy, resilience, and unacknowledged reality that would continue to shape lives across generations, while preserving appearances for the world outside the walls of the household.
The legacy of secrecy surrounding the president's private life extended far beyond his own household, influencing public perception, historical record, and the lives of those directly affected by his actions. While the public encountered a figure defined by authority, moral rectitude, and leadership, the hidden reality existed in stark contrast. The children born to his wife's enslaved sister occupied a position both intimately connected to power and completely denied by it. Their identities erased legally and socially. Their existence challenged the narratives of virtue and order promoted by the president, yet the structure of society, law, and custom ensured that this challenge remained invisible. The concealment of this truth became a cornerstone of maintaining authority, preserving reputation, and controlling memory. The consequences of this hidden truth were deeply personal for the children. They grew up understanding that their lives were shaped not by recognition or fairness, but by the dictates of law and social hierarchy. Their father's prominence offered no protection. Indeed, his status intensified the risks associated with exposure. Proximity to power magnified vulnerability rather than providing safety. Every decision they made, every interaction they engaged in, had to be navigated with acute awareness of the consequences of acknowledgement. Their daily existence was a study in tension, present yet denied, known yet invisible, biologically related yet legally and socially erased. The mother's role was central in mitigating these tensions. She provided care, instruction, and guidance within the constraints imposed by enslavement and law. Her efforts ensured that her children could survive and in some cases navigate pathways to opportunity that were otherwise inaccessible. She taught resilience, discretion, and the importance of reading social cues, instilling skills necessary for negotiating a world that denied them recognition. Her influence shaped the children's understanding of identity, survival, and agency, offering both protection and instruction in a system that was otherwise indifferent to their humanity. Education and opportunity were mediated by both law and discretion. The children's access to learning and skill development was limited by their status, yet proximity to power sometimes offered indirect advantages, such as exposure to knowledge, observation of leadership, and awareness of social networks. These benefits, however, were constrained and could not translate into legal or social recognition. The children's development was therefore characterized by a duality, acquiring knowledge and skills that positioned them for potential advancement, while remaining denied the legitimacy that might make such advancement fully possible. The psychological impact of these circumstances was profound. Growing up denied acknowledgement of their parentage and their full humanity. The children developed coping mechanisms that balanced visibility and invisibility, assertion and restraint. They learned to negotiate their presence carefully, to interpret the intentions of those around them, and to manage identity in ways that ensured survival. These strategies became integral to their development, influencing relationships, ambitions and perceptions of justice. The tension between connection and denial shaped self-perception and informed the strategies they would carry into adulthood. The household's management of this secret extended beyond immediate family to include staff, visitors and allies. Everyone operating within the household understood implicitly or explicitly the boundaries imposed by social expectation and law. The children were instructed directly or indirectly on how to navigate these boundaries, learning the rules that governed acknowledgement, visibility and interaction. The maintenance of secrecy relied on a combination of observation, silence and conformity, ensuring that the household's public image remained intact while private realities persisted unchecked. Legal structures reinforced the concealment and shaped daily life. Statutes regarding slavery, inheritance and legitimacy codified inequality, rendering the children legally invisible despite their biological connection to the president. These laws created a system in which private actions by those in power could occur without repercussion, while those subjected to denial had little reason. The interplay of law, social expectation and family dynamics ensured that the moral contradictions inherent in the household could persist indefinitely, shaping lives across generations and embedding inequity in both public and private spheres. Memory and narrative became tools of resistance and continuity. Oral histories, family stories, and private recollection preserved knowledge of lineage and experience despite legal erasure. These narratives allowed the children and their descendants to maintain a sense of identity, belonging, and historical connection that law and society denied. Memory became a repository of truth, counterbalancing the enforced invisibility and selective acknowledgement imposed by social structure. Through memory, the hidden history survived, ensuring that lineage and experience were transmitted across generations even when public recognition remained impossible. Socialization and identity formation were deeply influenced by these dynamics. Children learned from an early age to navigate a world in which recognition was conditional, identity was mediated by social expectation, and survival depended on discretion. They observed the privileges and behaviors of legitimate heirs, understood the limitations imposed upon themselves, and internalized lessons about power, hierarchy and the consequences of acknowledgement. These experiences shaped not only their understanding of self, but also their perception of authority, justice, and the social structures that governed their lives. Interpersonal relationships were shaped by secrecy and legal denial. Trust had to be carefully measured, affection had to be moderated by caution, and engagement with authority required constant awareness of boundaries. Friendships, mentorship and alliances were navigated with attention to what could be revealed and what must remain hidden. The strategies developed in childhood extended into adulthood, forming a framework for negotiating life in a society where lineage and recognition were closely regulated, and where connection to power could be both an asset and a liability. The broader societal implications of this concealment were significant. The ability of the president to maintain public respect while privately exercising authority over unacknowledged children illustrates how law, social expectation, and reputation intersected to protect power. Society benefited from the illusion of moral leadership while remaining oblivious to private exploitation, demonstrating how public narrative can be maintained at the expense of truth and justice. The children's experiences highlight the human cost of such systems, showing how private denial serves both to preserve authority and to perpetuate systemic inequality. The moral consequences extended to the household as a whole. Each member, whether by knowledge or participation, became complicit in maintaining the concealment. Silence, discretion, and strategic avoidance were necessary for survival, creating a culture in which truth was subordinated to the protection of image and authority. The tension between ethical awareness and social necessity shaped behavior, teaching lessons in compromise, endurance, and the negotiation of moral and practical imperatives. The children observed and internalized these dynamics, learning that survival often required adaptation to an environment that was morally compromised but socially enforced. Legal invisibility had profound implications for inheritance, property, and social mobility. The children were denied claims that might have otherwise altered their material circumstances, while their legitimate siblings received wealth, status, and protection by virtue of law. This legal exclusion reinforced the broader system of social hierarchy, ensuring that privilege remained concentrated and that those denied recognition were systematically The interplay of law, family, and social expectation created a structured inequality that affected not only the children themselves but successive generations, embedding the consequences of secrecy and denial into the fabric of social and familial life. Despite these challenges, resilience emerged as a central feature of the children's experience. Knowledge of lineage,
The ability to navigate social boundaries and the preservation of memory enabled survival and adaptation. They learned to reconcile pride in biological connection with the reality of denial, to cultivate skills that ensured personal agency, and to maintain identity despite systemic erasure. These strategies allowed them to navigate a complex social landscape, asserting presence where possible while minimizing risk, and creating a foundation for intergenerational survival that balanced truth with discretion. The children's lives also reveal the limitations of historical narrative in public memory. The concealment of their existence meant that public accounts of the president's life and legacy often omitted the complexity of his private actions, presenting an incomplete and sanitized version of history. The hidden truth challenges conventional narratives, highlighting the discrepancy between recorded history and lived experience. It underscores the importance of critical examination, attention to marginalized voices, and acknowledgement of the ways in which power, law, and social expectations shape both historical record and collective memory. In this context, the children's story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to endurance. Their existence demonstrates the human cost of legal and social denial, the strategies required for survival, and the resilience needed to maintain identity in the face of erasure. Memory, discretion, and adaptation became essential tools, allowing them to navigate a society structured to prioritize power and appearance over justice and acknowledgement. The household's concealment preserved public perception while shaping private realities, creating a legacy of secret resilience and unacknowledged connection that would influence lives across generations and remain hidden from public view while profoundly affecting every aspect of identity and historical record. The story of the president and the 6 children born to his wife's enslaved sister is more than a hidden chapter of history. It is a stark reminder of the complexities and contradictions that shaped a nation. It reveals how power, law, and social norms can coexist with moral compromise, how secrecy can protect authority while erasing truth, and how the human spirit endures even in the face of systemic denial. These children, though denied recognition, carried forward a legacy of resilience, memory, and identity that law and society could not erase. Their lives illuminate the human cost of injustice and the enduring consequences of choices made behind closed doors. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about lineage, power, and the ways in which history is recorded. It challenges the narratives we accept, urging a deeper understanding of the lives that were marginalized, silenced, or deliberately omitted from public memory. Yet within this darkness, there is also a testament to endurance, the ability of individuals and families to preserve identity, maintain connection, and navigate survival despite systemic erasure. Ultimately, this hidden truth compels reflection. It reminds us that history is never simply the story of those in power, but also of those whose lives were shaped, constrained, and often defined by it. It demands acknowledgement of resilience where recognition was denied, and understanding of humanity where law and society failed to see it. The legacy of these children is a call to remember the unseen, honor the silenced, and confront the truths that challenge the comfortable narratives of the past, ensuring that their story, though long hidden, is finally told and never forgotten.